Imagine watching the highest levels of American politics fold in real time. Chuck Schumer, the Senate veteran who's seen every play in the book, just blinked. And what triggered it wasn't a budget fight or even the government shutdown. It was a mayoral candidate in New York City, Zohran Mamdani, whose sudden rise has thrown the entire Democratic establishment into panic. Because if Mamdani wins, it won't just reshape New York, it could redefine what the Democratic Party even is. Schumer knows it, Trump knows it, and both men are playing a game far bigger than one election. Trump's already made his move a single, shocking statement that turned the race on its head. So the question now isn't just who wins in New York, it's who's really controlling America's future behind the curtain. Stick with me, because once you see how all the pieces fit together, you'll realize Schumer didn't just fold, he walked straight into Trump's trap. Let me take you inside what's really happening. Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, Democratic leader, someone who's played the political game longer than most of us have been paying attention, finds himself in an impossible position. On one side, he's got the traditional Democratic establishment, the donors, the moderate governors, all whispering that the party is veering too far left, losing touch with working Americans. On the other side, a vocal, energized, and increasingly powerful progressive wing that views any compromise as betrayal, any moderation as weakness. This isn't just political disagreement. This is an existential crisis for party leadership. Because here's what most people don't see on the evening news. Behind closed doors, moderate Democrats are genuinely panicking. They're watching poll numbers collapse in swing states. They're hearing from constituents who used to be reliable voters but now feel alienated by rhetoric that sounds more like revolution than reform. They're seeing the damage that comes from fielding candidates who seem more interested in ideological purity than practical governance. And in the middle of all this tension, what does Schumer do? He folds. Not because he wants to, not because it's strategic, but because he's genuinely afraid of being primaried, afraid of losing control of his caucus, afraid of being cast aside by the very movement his party helped create. The government shutdown we've been living through for over 30 days now, that's not really about budget negotiations or healthcare subsidies, though that's the story you'll hear repeated endlessly. It's about Schumer and Jeffries trying to prove to their radical base that they're willing to fight, willing to resist, willing to draw a line in the sand, even if that line makes no strategic sense, even if it hurts the very people they claim to champion. Because the alternative of being seen as weak, as moderate, as too willing to work with the other side, that terrifies them even more than the shutdown itself. Think about what that means for a moment. These are men who've spent decades in politics, who understand power dynamics better than almost anyone. And yet they're making decisions not based on what's best for the country, not based on sound strategy, but based on raw political survival instinct. That's not leadership. That's desperation dressed up in a suit. And that fear didn't start in Washington, it began in New York. Zohran Mamdani was a relatively obscure state legislator, but in the race to become mayor of America's largest city, he's suddenly become the front-runner, leading in multiple polls, generating enormous enthusiasm among young progressives, and presenting himself as the next chapter of Democratic politics. On the surface, it's an inspiring story. A young socialist reformer, barely in his 30s, championing causes like government-run grocery stores, massive tax increases on the wealthy, rent control expansions, and sweeping social programs. His campaign boasted remarkable grassroots energy, tens of thousands of volunteers, hundreds of thousands of doors knocked, a movement that seemed to emerge organically from the streets of New York. Except it didn't. What looked like grassroots turned out to be something else entirely. Investigative journalists started pulling threads, following money trails, examining the organizations supposedly supporting Mamdani independently. And what they found was shocking. Multiple reports have surfaced alleging that well over $40 million was funneled through a network of tax-exempt organizations, all supposedly independent, all supposedly grassroots, but all tracing back through overlapping executives, shared office spaces, and coordinated messaging to the same funding sources. We're talking about sophisticated money laundering techniques that resemble what you'd see in corporate fraud cases, not political campaigns. The most damning evidence? Internal memos from some of these organizations openly admitting to coordinating what are legally supposed to be independent expenditures. Under federal tax law, groups claiming tax-exempt status can't coordinate directly with campaigns. That's the whole point. They're supposed to be genuinely independent voices. But when you've got the same people running multiple organizations, sharing strategies, timing their messaging, and funneling resources in coordinated waves, that's not independence. That's a shell game. And here's where it gets even more troubling. Those so-called volunteers knocking on doors, reports suggest that over 1,000 of them weren't organic volunteers at all. They were paid operatives, funded through this coordinated network, deliberately deployed to create the appearance of grassroots momentum. Imagine that, paying people to pretend to be passionate citizens just to manufacture authenticity. It's political theater on a massive scale. But wait, there's more. And you're really not going to like this part. Remember how I mentioned tax-exempt organizations? Well, buried in the financial disclosures are government grants somewhere in the range of $50 million or more that were actually subsidizing the infrastructure of these organizations. In other words, taxpayer money, your money, was being used to build the very network that's now trying to influence elections. It's the same playbook we saw with certain foreign aid programs using public funds to build private political machines. When this information started breaking, the facade began to crack. What once looked like an inspiring grassroots movement suddenly resembled a well-funded corporate operation wearing a populist costume. The messenger might be talking about socialism and people power, but the machine behind him is anything but grassroots. It's manufactured, coordinated, and potentially illegal. And that revelation didn't just shake New York, it terrified the very people who built the system, because here's what Schumer and Jeffries understand that most people don't. Once the public sees through the illusion, once they realize they've been sold a story that isn't true, the backlash is swift and merciless. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. And in politics, trust is currency. Suddenly, those investigations that initially seemed like niche political insider news became front-page stories. Voters who'd been enthusiastic about Mamdani started asking uncomfortable questions. Moderate Democrats who'd been pressured to stay silent found their voice. And across party lines, people began recognizing a pattern. This wasn't just about one candidate in one race. This was about a systematic attempt to reshape American democracy through manufactured movements and dark money networks. The grassroots myth didn't just evaporate in New York. It exposed a vulnerability that extends nationwide. Because if it happened here, in America's largest city, in one of the most scrutinized political environments in the country, where else is it happening? How many other grassroots movements are actually well-funded operations designed to look authentic? And that's when Trump stepped in, not with a rally, but with a single calculated statement. Now, love him or hate him, and I know people feel strongly both ways, you have to appreciate Trump's sense of timing. While everyone else was caught up in the scandal, while the media was busy dissecting financial documents and interviewing campaign operatives, Trump waited. He watched. And then, at precisely the right moment, he made his move. On Truth Social, his preferred platform, Trump posted what looked like a simple statement but functioned more like a chess move than a comment. He said, essentially, if Mamdani wins, federal funding for New York will be minimal, limited only to what's legally required. No discretionary grants, no special considerations. Just the bare minimum. On its face, this might seem harsh, even punitive. But think about the message underneath. Trump was saying, if you elect someone who's been funded through questionable means, whose campaign appears to violate tax law, who's been supported by networks that potentially laundered money and used taxpayer resources for political gain, don't expect federal cooperation. Actions have consequences. Elections have consequences. But here's where it gets really interesting. Most people expected Trump to endorse Curtis Sliwa, the Republican candidate in the race. That would have been the obvious play, right? Support your party's nominee, rally the base, make it a partisan battle. But Trump didn't do that. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone. He pointed toward Andrew Cuomo, the former Democratic governor who'd resigned under scandal, who'd been out of politics, who most people assumed was finished. Why would Trump do that? Why would a Republican president essentially endorse a Democrat? Because Trump understood something that traditional politicians often miss. Sometimes the best strategy isn't to win the argument yourself, it's to create conditions where your opposition defeats itself. By elevating Cuomo as a potential alternative, Trump wasn't trying to install his preferred candidate. He was trying to fracture the Democratic coalition. He was giving moderate Democrats and even some Republicans a permission structure to vote against Mamdani without necessarily voting for Sliwa. He was turning a simple election into a three-way ideological battle where the progressive wing would be fighting moderates and conservatives simultaneously. It's brilliant in its simplicity, and devastatingly effective. That message didn't just stir headlines, it rewired the race overnight. Within hours, the political landscape shifted. Moderate Democrats who'd been holding their noses and preparing to vote for Mamdani out of party loyalty suddenly had an option. Cuomo, for all his flaws and baggage, represented something Mamdani didn't. Experience, establishment credibility, and most importantly, a signal that the party could still course correct, could still reject its most extreme elements without completely surrendering to Republicans. And Republicans? They faced an interesting calculation. Vote for Sliwa, who was polling in the low 20s with little chance of victory, or cross over to support Cuomo and actually prevent a socialist from taking control of the nation's largest city. For many, especially those more concerned about policy outcomes than party loyalty, the choice became obvious. Cuomo himself suddenly became a reluctant symbol of stability in a storm. His past scandals, which would normally disqualify him, seemed almost minor compared to the prospect of electing someone whose campaign appeared to be built on questionable financing and whose policies promised to transform New York into a laboratory for socialism. He didn't have to run a great campaign, he just had to not be Mamdani. He just had to represent an off-ramp from extremism. Behind the scenes, the panic intensified. Democratic donors, the ones who actually write the checks that keep campaigns running, started making phone calls. Governors from other blue states began questioning the strategy. Even some progressive members of Congress, seeing the writing on the wall, quietly distanced themselves from Mamdani's more radical proposals. The coalition that seemed so confident just weeks earlier was fracturing in real time. And Schumer, he's watching it all collapse, because this is the very trap he set for himself. This is the moment when Schumer realizes he's been playing the wrong game. His entire strategy of appeasing the progressive wing, of shutting down the government to prove his resistance credentials, of staying quiet about Mamdani's campaign because he didn't want to anger the base, all of it has backfired spectacularly. Now he faces an impossible choice. If he endorses Mamdani, he legitimizes everything the campaign represents, including the potentially illegal funding mechanisms. He owns whatever comes next. But if he distances himself, if he speaks up about the problems, he splits his own party right before a major election and confirms everything Trump has been saying about Democratic dysfunction. Either path leads to losing control of the narrative. Either path weakens his position. Behind closed doors, the pressure is immense. Jeffries, who'd reluctantly endorsed Mamdani earlier, is reportedly fielding angry calls from moderate members of his caucus who feel betrayed, who worry about being associated with a campaign that's now under investigation. Democratic strategists are running scenarios, trying to figure out how to contain the damage, not just in New York, but nationally, because they understand that what happens in this election will echo for years. And the cracks in New York merge something much bigger across the nation. Because here's what the political class doesn't always see, but regular Americans feel in their bones. There's been a quiet rebellion happening for years now. Not the kind that makes news. Not the kind with protests and signs, but the kind that shows up in voter registration data, in moving trucks headed from blue states to red states, in people quietly deciding they've had enough of policies that sound good in theory but fail catastrophically in practice. Across the country, the numbers tell a stark story. In every state that tracks voter registration by party affiliation, we're talking about over 24 states, Democrats have been losing registered voters while Republicans have been gaining them, not by small margins, by hundreds of thousands. Working class families, minorities, young people, demographics that Democrats assumed they owned, have been switching parties or becoming independents at historic rates. Why? Because slogans don't pay the bills. Because ideology doesn't put food on the table. Because when you're struggling to afford groceries and rent and gas, when you're watching your city deteriorate despite promises of progress, when you see your tax dollars funding programs that don't seem to help anyone except administrators and consultants, at some point you stop listening to what politicians say and start judging them by results. The more the Democratic Party has leaned left, the faster its base has eroded. It's not a coincidence, it's cause and effect. They're caught in what economists call a doom loop. Their policies create problems, which drives people away, which makes them rely even more on their activist base, which pushes them to adopt even more extreme policies, which creates even more problems, and around it goes. 8 of the 10 states with the highest housing costs are solid blue states. Think about that. The places with the strongest democratic control are the places where ordinary families can't afford to live. The same pattern shows up with taxes, with public safety, with education quality. The ideology that promises to help working people has, in practice, made their lives demonstrably harder. And that's why Trump's message resonates, even with people who don't particularly like him, because he's pointing at the pattern, naming it, refusing to pretend it doesn't exist. It's the same loop Schumer's trapped in, and the same one Trump knows how to break. While the media focuses on outrage, and believe me, there's been plenty of it, Trump focuses on leverage, and that's the difference between playing politics and playing the long game. See, most politicians think in 2-year or 4-year cycles, elections, terms, the next campaign. Trump thinks in decades. He's not trying to win individual battles. He's trying to reshape the entire battlefield. Every democratic overreach, every policy failure, every scandal like the Mamdani funding revelation, he turns it into a case study. Not just for this election, but for the next one and the one after that. When Trump threatened to cut federal funding to cities that elect candidates like Mamdani, the immediate response from many commentators was predictable. He's punishing voters. He's being vindictive. He's politicizing federal resources. But that misses the point entirely. Trump is reframing something fundamental about governance, the relationship between decisions and consequences. For too long, cities and states could implement whatever policies they wanted, watch those policies fail, create chaos and fiscal crises, and then expect the federal government, meaning taxpayers in other states, to bail them out. No accountability, no consequences, just an endless cycle of mismanagement subsidized by responsible jurisdictions. By saying, if you elect leaders whose campaigns violate the law, if you choose policies that demonstrably harm your citizens, don't expect federal resources to enable that dysfunction. Trump is doing something revolutionary. He's insisting on accountability. He's treating governance like what it should be, a responsibility with real consequences, not a consequence-free exercise in ideology. And here's the brilliant part. He's doing it in a way that puts Democrats in an impossible position. They can't argue against accountability without sounding reckless. They can't defend unlimited federal funding without explaining why responsible states should subsidize irresponsible ones. They can't make this about Trump being mean without addressing the underlying policy failures. It's political judo. Using your opponent's momentum against them. That's why the Mamdani moment isn't just a New York story, it's a national warning. Because what we're watching in New York is really a laboratory for what happens when ideology collides with reality. When promising everything to everyone meets the cold mathematics of budgets and human nature. When we'll just tax the rich runs into the fact that the rich have options, and many of them will simply leave. New York has been hemorrhaging residents for years now. Not just any residents, successful, productive, tax-paying residents. The people who fund the very social programs that progressives champion are voting with their feet, moving to Florida, Texas, Tennessee, places where their work is rewarded rather than penalized. And each one who leaves takes their tax revenue with them, which means less money for services, which means either higher taxes on those who remain or cuts to programs, which drives more people away. It's not theoretical. It's happening right now. The empire isn't just declining, it's accelerating its own decline through policy choices that sound compassionate but function as economic suicide. Businesses follow the same pattern. When regulations become impossible, when taxes become confiscatory, when crime makes commercial districts unsafe, companies close their New York locations and move somewhere more hospitable. And those aren't just statistics, those are jobs, careers, opportunities that leave with them. I've seen this pattern before in industry. When a company prioritizes ideology over fundamentals, when management makes decisions based on what sounds good in board meetings rather than what actually works in the real world, that company dies. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, but the outcome is inevitable. The same principles apply to cities and states. Rents in New York have reached levels that are genuinely absurd. Housing that working families could afford a generation ago now requires multiple six-figure incomes to rent, let alone own. Meanwhile, the policies intended to address affordability, rent control, restrictive zoning, endless regulations have systematically made the problem worse by reducing supply and increasing costs. The grocery store issue Mamdani has championed illustrates the problem perfectly. When potatoes cost several dollars per pound in some neighborhoods, the progressive solution is government-run grocery stores. But that doesn't address why prices are high in the first place: regulations, taxes, real estate costs, all driven by policy. It's like trying to fix a leak by mopping the floor while leaving the pipe broken. And when lifelong Democrats look around at the city they love becoming unlivable, at the schools declining, at the subways becoming dangerous, at their neighborhoods changing in ways that don't feel like progress, they start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, if these policies are supposed to help people like me, why is my life getting harder? That's when the conversation shifts from politics to people. Because here's what really matters, what gets lost in all the political maneuvering and strategic calculations. Actual human beings are being affected by these decisions. Real families trying to make ends meet, seniors on fixed incomes watching their purchasing power evaporate, young people wondering if they'll ever be able to afford to stay in the city where they grew up. I've been watching interviews with New York voters over the past few weeks, and they're revealing in ways that polls never capture. There's confusion, contradiction, and a desperate search for something that actually works. One voter, enthusiastic about Mamdani, talked about how millionaires don't pay their fair share of taxes and should be forced to pay more. When asked what happens if those millionaires leave, the response was essentially, good riddance. But who pays for the programs when the tax base shrinks? No answer. Just faith that somehow it'll work out. Another voter, when asked about government-run grocery stores, said it sounded great because there are too many hungry people and food costs too much. Reasonable concern? Absolutely. But when pressed on whether government has shown itself capable of running grocery stores efficiently when it struggles to run much simpler operations, or why private groceries are expensive in the first place again, no real answer. Just hope that intentions will somehow translate to results. Then there are the voters who can see through the contradictions, who point out that champagne socialists dining at expensive restaurants while promising to fight inequality might not be the most authentic messengers, who notice that candidates calling to defund the police somehow always have private security, who recognize the gap between rhetoric and reality, and perhaps most tellingly, there are the moderate Democrats, teachers, nurses, union workers, people who voted blue their entire lives, who feel completely abandoned by their own party, who say things like, I'm not against helping people, but these policies don't actually help. They just make everything more expensive and chaotic while the politicians pat themselves on the back. That realization is exactly what Trump wanted all along, because Trump's real strategy was never about winning arguments. It was about creating conditions where people would realize the truth themselves. You can lecture people all day about policy failures, but it won't stick until they experience it directly. You can warn about where certain ideologies lead, but people need to see it play out in real time. That's why Trump's intervention in the New York race was so perfectly timed. He didn't jump in early with endorsements and rallies. He waited until the cracks were already showing, until the investigations had revealed the manufactured nature of Mamdani's grassroots support, until moderate Democrats were already questioning their own party's direction. Then he made one move that accelerated all those existing doubts and divisions. By elevating Cuomo as an alternative, Trump didn't need to convince Democrats to vote Republican, a tough sell in deep blue New York. He just needed to convince them they had permission to vote against the radical progressive wing without feeling like they were betraying their values. He split the opposition. He turned what could have been a unified Democratic front into a circular firing squad. The trap closes. And that's exactly what happened. Schumer, who'd been trying to balance between moderates and progressives, between donors and activists, between governance and ideology, he folded. Not because Trump overpowered him, but because the contradictions within his own coalition became impossible to manage. Jeffries, who'd been pressured into endorsing Mamdani despite obvious reservations, found himself associated with a campaign that's now under multiple investigations, that's potentially violated federal tax law, that's alienated moderate Democrats across the country. His credibility, already shaky, took another hit. The shutdown that was supposed to demonstrate Democratic resolve instead demonstrated Democratic dysfunction. Polling showed that while Republicans took some blame, Democrats took more, and crucially, their own base turned on them. When you're hurting the people you claim to fight for, when even sympathetic commentators are calling you out, when members of your own party are publicly breaking ranks, you've lost the narrative. Trump didn't need to win the argument, he needed Democrats to implode publicly. Mission accomplished. Think about the cascade of failures from the Democratic leadership's perspective. They shut down the government to prove their toughness, but it made them look petty. They backed Mamdani to appease progressives, but it exposed the manufactured nature of progressive grassroots movements. They tried to make healthcare subsidies the central issue, but it reminded everyone that Democratic policies created the healthcare cost crisis in the first place. They attacked Trump's threat to cut funding as cruel, but it forced them to defend why cities should receive federal money regardless of how poorly they're managed. Every move they made to strengthen their position actually weakened it. Every tactical decision created strategic problems. It's like watching someone dig themselves deeper into a hole while insisting they're building a foundation. And Trump? He walks away holding the narrative once again, not by dominating the conversation, but by shaping the frame. The question isn't whether Trump is right or wrong about Mamdani. The question is whether Democrats can govern responsibly or whether they're captured by radicals who care more about ideology than outcomes. That's the debate Trump wants, because it's one Democrats can't win with their current coalition. The message is clear. Leadership isn't about control, it's about timing. Knowing when to act, when to wait, when to push, when to let your opposition defeat themselves. Schumer never understood that. He thought leadership meant managing competing factions, keeping everyone happy enough to stay together. But that's not leadership, that's just maintenance. And in a time of genuine crisis, maintenance isn't enough. So here we are in New York at the brink, Washington in turmoil, and America quietly choosing which direction to follow. History doesn't change when leaders make speeches. It changes when people stop believing the performance. And that's what we're witnessing right now. The performance that sustained Democratic power in major cities for generations, the idea that they're fighting for working people, that more government programs mean more help, that intentions matter more than results, that performance is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. New Yorkers are watching their city decline while being told it's actually progress. They're paying more for less while being told they're not paying enough. They're seeing crime increase while being told police are the problem. They're watching businesses leave while being told regulations protect them. At some point, the cognitive dissonance becomes too much. At some point, people start trusting their own eyes instead of the narrative. And that awakening, that quiet realization spreading through blue cities and states across America, that's the real story. Not who wins this particular mayoral race, though that matters. But whether we're witnessing the beginning of a genuine political realignment, where the party that positioned itself as the champion of working people loses working people because it stopped actually championing them, Trump didn't need to shout this time. He didn't need to dominate news cycles with controversial statements. He just waited and let them walk into the trap themselves. That's the difference between playing politics and changing politics, between winning news cycles and winning the long game, between forcing your way through obstacles and letting obstacles consume your opposition. If you've seen enough political theater to last a lifetime, if you're ready for truth over talking points, then make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling me what you think about this unfolding story. Because this time, it's not just about elections, it's about who's really writing America's next chapter. Is it going to be political machines manufacturing grassroots movements with dark money, or is it going to be actual citizens making actual choices based on actual results? Is it going to be ideology regardless of consequences, or accountability regardless of ideology? Is it going to be leaders who fold under pressure from their own extremes, or leaders who understand that real strength comes from principles, not polls? New York is voting today. The rest of the country is watching. And whatever happens in that election will echo far beyond one city, one race, one moment. Because the trap that closed on Schumer and Jeffries is closing on an entire political philosophy that promised everything and delivered decline. And the voters who see that, who recognize what's really happening beneath all the noise and spin, those are the people who will decide not just this election, but the direction of American politics for years to come. The question is, are there enough of them? Are enough people awake to what's happening? Have enough families experienced the reality behind the rhetoric? Tomorrow, we start getting answers.